You can tell a lot about a man by what he refuses to tear down. I've ranched this stretch of high prairie for 31 winters, and in all that time I never once thought a rusted-out grain silo would be the thing that kept 5 human beings breathing through the coldest night this county ever recorded. Folks laughed at Holly's tanner for keeping that old steel drum standing. The bank man laughed. The neighbors laughed quieter, the way people do when they think they're being kind. Even I laughed. God forgive me, I laughed too. I'm telling you this story because I owe it to him, and because I've never been able to set it down right in my own head until I said it out loud. I keep a little spiral notebook in my coat pocket, have my whole life, and I write down the weather and the calving numbers and sometimes a thing my late wife said that I don't want to lose. There's a page in one of those notebooks, smeared and water-warped, where I wrote 4 words the morning after, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The silo held, they lived. That's the ending. I'm giving it to you up front because I'm not a man who believes in keeping people in suspense over whether a child survives. What I can't give you up front is the rest, how it happened, what it cost, what I saw a tired father do in the dark that I'll be chewing on till they put me in the ground. Stay with me. It's worth the cold. The first thing I remember is the silence breaking. I was standing in my own kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, and it had gone dark as dusk outside, which it had no business doing in the middle of December at 4 o'clock. There should have been an hour of gray light left at least. I had the radio going low, the AM station out of the county seat, and the fellow on it had stopped reading the livestock report and started saying numbers I didn't like. Wind chill. Accumulation. The word historic, which weathermen throw around the way preachers throw around blessed, until the one time they mean it. I'd lived on the prairie long enough to feel a storm in my back teeth before any radio told me. This one I'd felt 3 days coming. The cattle felt it too. They'd been crowding the fence line, restless, lowing at nothing, the way animals do when the pressure drops out from under the world. My old dog Cricket wouldn't leave the wood stove. She's a healer, scared of nothing. Once stared down a bull twice and won both times. And she lay there with her chin on her paws and her eyes following me around the room like she was asking why I wasn't already doing something. I should explain about the tanners, because they're the heart of this, and I was only ever the man at the edge of the firelight. Holly's tanner had the half section just north of mine. He'd bought it cheap 11 years back, when it was a foreclosure with a caved-in barn and a house that leaned, and everybody including me figured he'd last 2 winters before he sold it back to the bank and slunk off to whatever city he'd come from. He didn't talk like us. He'd been some kind of engineer, I gathered, before his wife got sick the first time and they decided, the way couples sometimes do when they've had a scare, that they wanted to raise their kids somewhere with sky. Janelle, that was the wife. She'd beaten the cancer once, beaten it down to nothing, then watch it come walking back up the road 2 springs later. By the December I'm telling you about, Janelle Tanner was thin as a fence wire and she had maybe months. Everybody knew it the way you know things in the country, nobody said it. There were 3 kids. The oldest, Mara, was 14 and serious as a judge, with her mother's habit of pushing her glasses up her nose with one knuckle. The middle boy, Eli, was 9 and never stopped moving. And the little one, the surprise, the one they'd named Joy because Janelle said after the second diagnosis that she wasn't going to let the word leave her house. Joy was 4. Now the silo. When Holly's bought the place, there was an old galvanized grain silo standing out behind the barn, the squat fat kind, maybe 20 feet across and not much taller, dating back to the homestead days. The kind nobody builds anymore. It hadn't held grain in 40 years. Every sensible man in the county told Holly's to drop it, said it was an eyesore, said the steel was worth something for scrap, said it had come down on somebody in a high wind. The bank actually wrote it into the appraisal as a liability. And Holly's tanner looked at that silo, and instead of tearing it down, he spent 2 years fixing it up. He didn't make it a grain silo again. He made it, and I remember thinking he'd lost his mind when I first walked through it. He made it into a kind of root cellar and storm room and workshop, all in one. He poured a new floor. He sealed the seams. He cut a low, heavy door into the side and hung it on welded hinges, and he insulated the inside walls with a foot of straw bales and salvaged foam, every inch, floor to that domed ceiling. He ran a little wood stove in there with the pipe punched out through the top. He stocked it with jars, Janelle's canning, hundreds of jars, tomatoes and beans and peaches glowing like jewels on the shelves he'd built around the curve of the wall. I asked him once, leaning on the doorframe with a cup of his coffee, why a man would put so much of himself into an old tin can. He didn't answer right away. He had this way of going quiet before he said anything that mattered, like he was running the numbers one more time. Then he said, "Round things are strong, Walt. A square house fights the wind. This thing just lets it go around." He patted the curved wall like it was a horse. "And it's the warmest place on the property. If it ever comes down to it, if it ever really comes down to it, this is where I'd put my family." I nodded like I understood. I didn't, not really. I thought it was a grieving man building himself a fort against a thing no fort could keep out. I thought, the way the whole county thought, that Holly's tanner had a screw working loose, and that you couldn't blame him with his wife dying in the front bedroom. I was wrong about almost everything, and I had about 6 hours left before the prairie taught me how wrong. The wind came early. That's the part the forecasters got wrong and the part that nearly killed everybody. The big snow wasn't supposed to hit till near midnight. But the wind arrived at 4:45, and it arrived the way a freight train arrives, with a sound before the thing itself. I was pulling on my second pair of socks when I heard it cross the open ground from the northwest, a long building roar that started low and climbed. And by the time it hit the house, the windows were singing in their frames, and the wood stove sucked and shuddered, and Cricket was on her feet with every hair up her spine. I got my chores done in a haze. You don't think in a wind like that. You just move, head down, one glove clamped over the brim of your hat. I broke ice and threw extra hay and got the horses into the lean-to, and the wind tried to take the gate out of my hands twice, and I felt the first snow come into it. Not falling. Snow doesn't fall in a wind like that. It comes sideways, and it comes hard, little frozen pellets that find the half-inch of bare wrist between your glove and your sleeve and burn you there. By the time I got back inside, it was full dark, and the temperature was dropping like a stone down a well. I want to be honest about something. I didn't think about the tanners right away. I'd love to tell you I did. I'd love to tell you I was the good neighbor who thought of the dying woman and the 3 children before I thought of my own warm kitchen. But the truth is, I sat down by my stove with a bowl of beans and Cricket pressed against my leg, and I thought, thank God I got everything in, and I let the wind howl, and it was the better part of an hour before the phone rang. The phone ringing in a storm like that is a sound that goes straight into your gut. Nobody calls in a blizzard for a good reason. It was Holly's. The line was bad, full of static and the moan of the wind on his end too, and his voice when it came through was wrong, tight, controlled, the voice of a man holding very still so as not to scream. "Walt, the power's out and the furnace went with it. I can't, Walt, the propane line, I think the regulators froze. I can't get heat in the house." "You got your generator." "It won't turn over. It's 40 below in the wind out there, Walt. It won't turn over." A pause, and in the pause I heard a child crying somewhere behind him, the high, thin, endless crying of a little one who's cold and scared and doesn't have the words. "I'm going to move them to the silo," he said. "I've got the stove out there, I've got everything out there. I just—" "Janelle can't." His voice broke clean in half and came back together by force. "She can't walk far, and the snow's already past my knees against the house." I was already standing. I was already pulling my coat on with the phone jammed against my ear. "How far's the silo from the house?" 60 yards. 60 yards. I want you to understand what 60 yards is in a 40 below wind with the snow coming sideways so thick you can't see your own hand at the end of your arm. 60 yards is the distance across an ocean. 60 yards is the kind of distance men have died crossing within sight of their own front doors, found in the spring 20 feet from the porch, frozen mid-crawl. Hollies knew that. He was an engineer. He'd have run the numbers. That's why he called me. Not because I could get there. There was no getting there. Not across the open ground between our places. But because he needed one other human being to know what he was about to try. Hollies, I said, listen to me. Tie a rope. You hear me? You run a rope from the house door to the silo door and you don't let go of it, not for anything. You carry the little one. You put Mara in front and Eli behind, and you keep Janelle in the middle where the winds broke by your bodies. And you count them. Every few feet you count them out loud all the way so you know nobody's slipped off the line. I know, he said. I know, yeah. And then quieter, almost like he was talking to himself. I built it for this. I built the whole thing for exactly this. You did, I told him, and I meant it now. I meant it in a way I hadn't 6 hours before. You did, Hollies, now go. The line went dead. I'm going to tell you what I did next, and I'm not proud of it, and I'm not ashamed of it either, because there are some things a man simply cannot do, and crossing open prairie blind in a killing wind is one of them. I tried to go. I got as far as my own gate. I got the truck started and got maybe 200 feet down my drive before the world turned solid white in the headlights. A white that had no up or down or sideways in it. And I felt the truck drift off the track and the back wheels start to spin. And I understood with a cold, clear certainty that if I kept going I would die out there and never reach them and just be one more body for the spring. So I backed up, by feel mostly, by the fence line ghosting in and out of the wash of white. I got the truck turned and I got it back to the house, and I sat in my dark kitchen with my coat still on and the snow melting off me into the floorboards, and I did the only thing left to a man in my position, which is the hardest thing, which is to wait and not know. I lit a lamp and I put it in the kitchen window facing north. It was a foolish thing to do. There was no chance on earth they could see a lamp through that storm, not at 60 yards from their own door, let alone a half-mile across to mine. But I lit it anyway, and I sat by it, and Cricket put her head in my lap, and I'll tell you the truth, I prayed. I'm not a praying man. I hadn't said a word to God since I buried my Ruth 8 years back, and felt that he'd taken her too soon to deserve much conversation from me. But I prayed that night. I prayed for a family I'd half pitied and half laughed at, a strange, quiet engineer, and his dying wife and their 3 children, crossing 60 yards of hell on the end of a rope. This is the part I had to piece together after, from Hollies, from Mara, from the things they said in the weeks that followed, and the things they never quite said. So bear with me if I tell it like I was there. In every way that counts, I've been there 1,000 times since. He tied the rope to the door frame of the house. Good rope. His climbing rope from some younger life, he never did say. He dressed them in everything they owned, layer on layer, until little Joy was so bundled she could barely bend her arms, and he'd zipped her into the front of his own coat against his chest so his body would shield her. He'd put Mara at the front because she was the steadiest, and because she was the one who'd been carrying too much of the household weight all that hard autumn, and he trusted her. Eli behind, Janelle in the middle. And then there was the matter of Janelle, who could not walk 60 yards, who could barely walk to the bathroom by that December, who weighed, by then, less than her 14-year-old daughter. Here's the decision. Here's the heavy thing I promised you. Hollies had a sled, a plastic kid's toboggan, the kind you'd buy at the hardware store for $10. He'd thought of everything else. He'd thought of the rope and the layers and the stocked silo and the counting. But he had one body that couldn't move and 2 arms, and one of those arms had a 4-year-old zipped against his heart. He could not carry his wife and his baby both. He had to choose what to do with his hands, and there was no good answer, only a worst one and a less worst one, and he had about 4 seconds to find it with the furnace dead, and the house already going cold as a tomb around them. What he did was this. He put Janelle on the sled, and he put the loop of the sled rope into Mara's hands, 14 years old, and he said to his daughter, in a voice she told me later she had never heard him use before and never heard again, "You are pulling your mother. You do not stop. You do not let go. No matter what happens behind you, you keep pulling and you keep walking and you get to that silo. That's your only job in this whole world right now. Do you understand me?" And Mara, who pushed her glasses up her nose with one knuckle, said, "Yes, Dad." He'd given his sick wife's life into the hands of a child because there was no other hand to give it to. And then he'd opened the door. The wind took the door out of his grip and slammed it back against the wall hard enough to crack the glass. The cold that came through wasn't like cold I can describe to you. Mara said it didn't feel like cold at all. It felt like being grabbed, like the whole night reached in and grabbed them. And the lamp Holly's was carrying snuffed out instantly, and they went from a dim, warm house into pure black roaring nothing in the space of one heartbeat. They got out. He pulled the door shut behind them by feel, and he found the rope, and he started counting. Mara. Here. Eli. Here. Joy. And he felt her squirm against his chest, alive, furious, screaming, the most beautiful sound in the world. Janelle. And from the sled, from down near the snow, a voice so thin he felt it more than heard it. "Here. I'm here, Hollies, go." 60 yards. In the dark. On a rope. A man with his baby against his heart. A boy with his fists wound into his father's coat. A girl bent double dragging a sled with her dying mother on it through snow that was already past her knees and climbing. The wind didn't blow, Mara said. The wind pressed, like a hand trying to push them all flat into the ground and bury them where they fell. She counted her steps. She told me that. She counted them out loud under her scarf. 1, 2, 3, 4, and somewhere around 40, the sled snagged on something under the snow and stopped dead, and she pulled, and it wouldn't come, and for one long, terrible moment she felt the whole night winning, felt her own legs failing, felt the thought arrive that she could let go of the rope and lie down, and the cold would stop hurting so much. And then her mother's voice from the sled, from somewhere down in the dark and the snow, faint but absolutely clear. "Pull, baby, I've got you, pull." Which made no sense. Janelle was the one being pulled. She couldn't help. She was the helpless one, the weight, the burden Hollies had agonized over. But Mara said that in that moment, hearing her dying mother say, "I've got you," to the daughter who was the only thing keeping her alive, something turned over in her chest, some last reserve she didn't know a 14-year-old could have. And she put her head down and she hauled, and the sled tore free of whatever held it, and she walked. 1, 2, 3, 4. Joy screaming against Hollies' heart, the only warmth he could feel. Eli's fists in his father's coat. The rope burning through Hollies' frozen glove, the only thing in the universe that was real and true and led somewhere. And then Mara's outstretched hand, swinging blind, hit cold curved steel. The silo. I didn't know any of that yet. Across the half-mile of screaming dark, in my own kitchen, all I knew was the lamp in the window and the dog in my lap and the not knowing, which is its own particular kind of cold. I sat up the whole night. The wind didn't break till near dawn, and when the gray light finally came up over a world gone smooth and white and strange, every fence post wearing a long tail of drift, every familiar shape erased and made over into something from another planet, I looked north, the way I'd been looking all night, toward the Tanner place. I couldn't see the house. The snow was too deep, the air still too thick. But I could see the silo, the squat old galvanized grain silo that every sensible man in the county had told Hollies Tanner to tear down. It stood there in the first light, frosted white on its windward side, dark on its lee, standing exactly as it had stood through 100 years of prairie winters, round and stubborn and strong. And from the little stovepipe punched out through the top of its domed roof, thin and straight and steady in the dead calm morning air, there was a ribbon of wood smoke rising. Somebody in there had a fire going. I started to cry then, sitting at my kitchen table, an old man who hadn't cried since he buried his wife. I cried because of the smoke. Just the smoke. Because smoke means fire and fire means somebody alive to tend it, and I had spent the whole longest night of my life not knowing, and now I knew at least that much. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't know for 2 more hours, until I dug out my truck and broken trail across that transformed and silent world to hammer on a curved steel door with my heart in my throat, was how many of them I'd find alive on the other side of it. I'm going to make you wait for that, the same way I had to wait. It's the only honest way to tell it. It took me the better part of 2 hours to reach them, and I will tell you, every minute of it was a kind of penance. The drifts had done their work in the night. My drive was gone, not buried, gone, the way a road goes when the wind packs the snow so tight you could drive a tractor over the top of it without breaking the crust. I dug the truck out by hand first, then gave up on the truck entirely when I saw what the open ground between our places had become. The half-mile of pasture had set up overnight into a frozen sea, long ridges of drift 4 and 5 feet high running northwest to southeast, hard as concrete on top and bottomless powder underneath wherever the crust gave way. A truck would have high-centered in 50 yards. So I strapped on the old wooden snowshoes that had hung on my mudroom wall since Ruth's father left them to me, and I left Cricket whining at the door, and I went on foot. I want to describe the quiet to you, because it's the thing I wasn't ready for. After a night of that much wind that had screamed and pressed and torn at the world for 13 straight hours, the morning was silent in a way that hurt the ears. No bird, no engine, no wind. Just the squeak and crunch of my own snowshoes and the sound of my own breathing, loud as a bellows inside the scarf I'd wrapped over my face. The sky had gone that hard scrubbed blue that comes after the worst of it, and the sun was up and blazing off all that white so fierce I had to crack my eyes to slits. And the cold was still down past 30 below, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak like styrofoam and freezes the inside of your nose with the first breath. A beautiful morning. A morning that had no business being beautiful, sitting where it was, on top of whatever it was sitting on top of. I climbed and slid and fell through that frozen sea, and the whole way the silo grew slowly closer, and the whole way that thin straight ribbon of smoke kept rising from the top of it, and I held onto the smoke the way Mara had held onto the rope. Somebody's alive in there. Somebody's tending a fire. Hold onto the smoke. But here's the thing about smoke. Smoke only tells you one person's still breathing. It doesn't tell you which one. And the closer I got, the more my mind started doing the cruel arithmetic that minds do. 5 of them had gone out into that storm. 5. A man, a woman who could barely walk, a teenager, a 9-year-old, a 4-year-old. I told Hollies to count them on the rope, but counting them on the rope only got them out the door. 60 yards is a long way. People slip off ropes. People fall, and the others, half frozen and blind and carrying their own, don't feel the weight go. By the time I reached the Tanner place, I had convinced myself, in the deep, wordless animal part of me, that I was about to walk into a tragedy with one survivor in it, and the only question left was which. I reached the silo. I put my mitten flat against the curved steel of it, and the steel was so cold it bit through the wool. And I hammered on the low welded door with the side of my fist, and I shouted their name into the silence, Tanner, Hollas, it's WALT. And my voice came out cracked and small in all that white. For a long moment, nothing. The longest moment of my life, longer than the night. And then I heard it, a sound from inside, a scrape, a bump, the heavy iron clank of a bar being lifted. Hollies had barred the door from the inside against the wind, and then the door swung in, and a wall of warm air rolled out over me, warm and close and smelling of wood smoke and straw and people and something else underneath, something faintly sweet, and out of the dim gold light inside it a face appeared. Hollies. He looked 100 years old. His face was burned raw down one side where the wind had gotten at it, the skin gone white and waxy at the very tip of his nose, and one earlobe frostbite, the early kind, the kind you can save if you're lucky. His eyes were sunk back in his head. He hadn't slept. He had the look of a man who'd been holding the roof up with his bare hands all night and only just now heard somebody coming to take a corner of the weight. He looked at me, and his mouth worked, and what he finally got out in a voice like a rusted hinge was not help or thank God or any of the things a man might say. What he said was, "All five, Walt, all five of us, we all made it. I'm going to take you inside the silo now, because I stepped through that door, and what I saw in there I have never forgotten, and I think it's the truest picture of what a family is that I ever expect to be given in this life." The inside of that old grain silo had become, in the space of one night, the warmest and most human place I have ever stood. Holly's little wood stove sat in the center of the floor, ticking and glowing, the fire in it banked low and steady. He'd been rationing the wood, I'd learn, not knowing how long they'd be in there, feeding it one split at a time through the small hours. The straw bales he'd lined the walls with all those years ago, the insulation everybody'd called the work of a crank, threw the heat back in and held it close, and the curved domed ceiling gathered the warmth up under it like a held breath. The shelves ran all the way around, that great spiral of glass jars I'd seen him stocking, and the firelight caught in every one of them, so the whole round room glowed amber and red and gold. Janelle's canning, all her summers put up in glass, throwing back the light of the fire that was keeping her children alive. And there, on a nest of quilts and horse blankets that Holly's must have hauled out there sometime in the fall and never mentioned, was the family. Janelle was propped up against the curved wall, wrapped in everything they owned, and she was alive, pale as the snow outside, her lips bloodless, every breath visible as work but alive, and her eyes were open and they were clear. Beside her, sound asleep at last with her thumb in her mouth and her face still blotchy from all that crying, was little Joy. Eli was curled against his mother's other side, also asleep, one hand fisted in the hem of her coat the way it had been fisted in his father's coat out in the dark. And Mara was sitting up. Mara hadn't slept either. She was sitting cross-legged by the stove with the fire's light on her glasses so I couldn't see her eyes, and across her lap was the long-handled iron poker, and I understood after a moment that she had appointed herself keeper of the fire, that she and her father had taken the night in shifts, that this serious 14-year-old girl, who had dragged her dying mother 60 yards through a killing storm on the end of a $10 sled, had then sat up half the night feeding a fire, one stick at a time, so that nobody would freeze while her father got an hour's sleep. She looked up at me when I came in. She pushed her glasses up her nose with one knuckle, and she said, in a voice that was trying so hard to be a grown-up's voice and almost made it, "We saved you some peaches, if you want. Mom said you would have helped if you could have gotten here." I had to turn around and face the door for a minute. I'm not too proud to tell you that. I stood there with my back to that family and my hand on the cold steel, and I got myself back together. And when I trusted my voice, I turned around and I said I'd love some peaches. Thank you. And I sat down on the floor among them, and Holly's barred the door again behind me against the cold. And for a little while, there was nothing in the whole frozen world but the five of us and the fire, and the glow of all those jars. Now, I told you in the first part of this that I'd make you wait to find out how many of them lived, the way I had to wait. All five. I gave that to you. But I'd be lying to you if I let you think the night had been clean, that they'd crossed the 60 yards and tumbled into the warm silo and that was the end of the danger. It wasn't. The worst single moment of that night didn't happen in the storm at all. It happened inside the silo after they'd made it when they thought they were safe. And it's the part Holly's told me only much later, in pieces, the way a man tells you a thing he's still scared of. It was Janelle. She'd held on through the crossing. She'd called "Pull, baby. I've got you" up to her daughter from the sled when she had no breath to spare for it. She kept herself conscious through 60 yards of the kind of cold that puts healthy men to sleep forever. And then they'd gotten her inside, and gotten the fire built up, and gotten her wrapped, and the moment the danger was past, The moment her body understood it could finally stop fighting, it nearly stopped altogether. Holly said she went gray. He said her breathing, which had been bad, went to almost nothing, long gaps, he said, where he'd count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, and her chest wouldn't move, and he'd think, this is it, here in front of the children, this is where it happens, and then she'd drag in one more breath, shallow as a teaspoon, and the count would start over. He said the cold and the effort together had taken her right to the edge of the thing the cancer had been walking her toward for 2 years, and for about an hour in the middle of that night, while the storm screamed against the curved steel walls, Holly's tanner sat holding his wife in the firelight and genuinely did not know, breath to breath, whether she would take another one. And here's the heavy thing. Here's the second impossible decision, because the man had a night just full of them. The kids didn't know. Eli and Joy were asleep, but Mara was awake. Mara was always awake. That was her curse that night. She saw everything, and Mara was watching her mother turn gray across the firelight, and she started to come over, and Holly's had to make a choice in that second too. He could let his daughter come and hold her mother's hand and maybe, if it went the way it looked like going, be there for it. Or he could send her away from it, spare her the watching. Keep one more terrible image out of a 14-year-old's head for the rest of her life. He chose to spare her. He told her gently, he said, though his insides were screaming, that Mom was just resting, that the best thing Mara could do was keep the fire going. That fire was her job, the most important job, and he needed her on it. He gave his daughter a task to point her eyes at so they wouldn't be pointed at her dying mother. And Mara, who I think knew exactly what he was doing and let him do it because she needed it too, took up the poker and turned to the fire and kept it burning all the rest of that night, with her back to whatever was happening behind her. That's why she was still sitting there with the poker when I came through the door in the morning. She'd never been relieved of the duty. She just kept doing the thing her father gave her to do, hour after hour, because as long as she was doing it, she didn't have to turn around. Janelle didn't die that night. Her breathing came back. Sometime before dawn, the gaps got shorter and the gray went out of her face and she slept, and Holly's felt her warm and breathing against him, and finally, let himself close his eyes for 1 hour while Mara kept the fire. But it had been close. It had been a coin spinning in the air for an hour in the dark, and I think Holly's knew, and I think Mara knew, that they had all of them, every one of them, even little sleeping Joy, been gathered that night around the actual edge of the thing, and had looked over it, and had been allowed this once to step back. We spent that whole first day in the silo, the 6 of us, because there was nowhere else to be. The house was a frozen tomb. I waded over and checked it around midday, and the inside of it was colder than a meat locker, ice on the inside of the windows, the dead furnace ticking as it shrank in the cold. There was no living in that house until the power came back, and the power I knew might be days. Lines down all across the county. We'd hear later that 3 people died in that storm in our county alone. An old man who went out to his woodpile and got turned around 20 feet from his door. A couple stranded on the highway who ran their car for warmth till it ran out of gas. 3 deaths, and all 3 of them people who'd had warm houses to be in, just for one wrong moment. And here was Holly's Tanner's family, 6 of us now, warm as toast in a tin can everybody told him to tear down. I'll tell you what that day was like, because I think it's the part of the story that matters most, and it's the part nobody ever asks about. They ask about the storm, the crossing, the rope, the drama. Nobody asks about the day after, the ordinary day, the long quiet day inside the silo while the world froze solid outside. But that day was the best day I've spent in years, and I think it might have been the best day that family spent together in all the hard time they had left, and I think there's a lesson in that I'm still working out. We ate, good Lord, we ate. Janelle, awake now and a little color back in her, directed operations from her nest of quilts like a general, the green beans, Holly's, and there's a ham put up on the 3rd shelf, and Mara show Walt where the bread's at. They had bread out there, sealed in tins. They had a whole pantry out there. The man had built a working homestead inside a grain silo and stocked it for a siege, and the county had laughed. And now the county's laughter was 3 people frozen in their own yards, and this family eating ham and green beans and peaches by firelight. Alive, all of them, every one. Eli woke up and was 9 years old again within about 10 minutes. The resilience of a child is a thing that ought to be studied by serious people, and spent the afternoon showing me a fort he'd made among the straw bales and asking me 40 questions about snowshoes. Joy woke and cried for a bit and then climbed into my lap, a stranger's lap, with the total trust of the very young, and fell back asleep there. And I sat very still for an hour so as not to wake her, and felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt since Ruth and I lost the baby we lost, a long time ago, a story for another day. And Janelle watched all of it from her quilts with her clear pale eyes, watched her children eat and laugh and play in the gold firelight of the strange round room, and there was a look on her face I have tried to describe to myself 100 times since and never quite managed. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was bigger and sadder and more complete than happiness. It was the look of a woman who knows to the day how little time she has left, watching the people she loves be safe and warm and whole in front of her, and understanding that this here now, this stolen day in a tin can in the middle of a frozen, ruined world, was a gift she had not expected to be given. She caught me looking. She always caught everything. And she smiled at me, this thin, tired, knowing smile, and she said, quiet enough that the kids couldn't hear over Eli's chatter, "He's not crazy, you know, Hollies. Everybody always thought he was a little crazy building this." She looked around the warm, glowing room, the jars, the fire, her sleeping baby in a neighbor's lap. "He just loves us more than he cares what people think. That's all it ever was." I've gone back and forth on whether to tell you the next part here or save it, because the next part is where the story turns, and it doesn't turn the way you'd expect after a day like that. You'd expect it to turn toward grief, toward the thing we all knew was coming for Janelle, sooner now rather than later. And that thing did come in its time. But that's part 3, and that's not actually where this story breaks. Where it breaks is 2 days later when the county finally got a plow up our road and the power came flickering back, and the immediate danger was past, and I helped Hollies carry his family back across the snow to their thawing house. Because that should have been the end of it. The storm survived, the family safe, the good neighbor's debt repaid. A clean ending. Except that as we were closing up the silo, banking the fire down, latching the shelves, making the round room ready to be left, Holly stopped me with a hand on my arm, and he had a look on his face I hadn't seen before, not in the storm, not in the long night, not in any of it. A scared look. The look of a man about to say a true thing he's been carrying too long. "Walt," he said, "I have to tell you something, and I need you to not say anything to Janelle." And he told me, and it changed everything I thought I understood about that night, about the silo, about why a dying woman's husband had spent 2 years of borrowed time building a fortress against a storm. But I'm going to make you wait for that, the same as before. Some things you have to earn the hearing of. He told me with his hand still on my arm, in the half-dark of the cooling silo, with his family already gone ahead across the snow to the thawing house. He spoke low and fast, the way men do when they've decided to say a thing, and are afraid that if they slow down they'll lose the nerve. "I didn't build it for the storm, Walt. I waited. The fire was banked down to coals and the room had gone dim, and the jars on the shelves had stopped glowing and gone back to being just jars in the gloom. The storm last night, I always knew a bad winter could come, sure, I'm not a fool, I built it strong enough for anything, but that's not why I built it. That's not why I poured 2 years into it when Janelle was sick and we had no money and everybody thought I'd come unhinged." He took a breath that shook. "The doctors told me, a long time ago now, how it was going to go for her. At the end, they told me she'd be bedridden. They told me she'd need to be kept warm, really warm, constant. The cold would be agony for her by then. And they told me that the most important thing, the thing she wanted more than anything, was to not die in a hospital. To die at home, with her kids, in her own place. I think I'd already started to understand. I think some part of me had understood since I first stepped into that warm, glowing room and felt how finished it was, how lovingly made, how it had the feeling not of a fort, but of a place built to hold something precious and fragile and final. That house, Walt, Holly's voice cracked. That cold-leaning house with the bad furnace and the wind coming through every wall. If the power went out in winter, and it goes out every winter, she'd freeze in her own bed before I could get her anywhere. I couldn't have that. I couldn't have her last days, the days she wanted at home, be days she spent cold and scared and waiting for the lights to come back on. He gestured around at the round, warm room he'd made, the straw walls, the little stove, the jars of all her summers. So I built her this, a place I could keep warm with my own 2 hands no matter what the world did, a place that doesn't need the power company or the propane company or anybody, a place where she could be home and warm and surrounded by her own work, her own life, everything she put up with her own hands right to the very end. He stopped, he looked at the floor. I built my wife a place to die in, Walt, and I never told her what it really was. I let everybody think I was a crank with a tin can fort because the truth was too, he couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. And then the part that had put the scared look on his face, the part he'd needed to tell someone. Last night, he said, in the storm when she went gray, when she stopped breathing for those long stretches and I sat there holding her and counting, Walt, I realized I was sitting in the exact place I'd built for it to happen. I'd built her this perfect warm sanctuary to die in, and there I was, watching her almost do it. Too soon. Years of work for the right ending, and it almost came for the wrong reason. A storm, a fluke, instead of when she's ready, when it's her time, the way she wanted. His hands were shaking. I built a place to lose her gently, and last night it almost took her violently, and I can't ever tell her that's what this place is. How do you tell your wife you built her a beautiful place to die? I didn't have an answer for him. There isn't one. I put my hand over his hand on my arm, an old man's chapped hand over a younger man's, and we stood there in the dim and the cooling, and I let him not be alone with it for a minute. That's all I had to give. Sometimes that's all there is. I kept his secret. I want you to know that. For all the months that followed, I never said a word to Janelle, though Lord knows she was sharp enough to have worked half of it out on her own, the way she worked everything out. The thaw came late that year, the way it does after a hard winter, like the ground itself was reluctant to trust the warmth. But it came. The drifts that had buried my drive shrank down to gray, crusted heaps in the fence corners and then to nothing. And underneath them the prairie came up matted and brown and then, almost overnight the way it does, green. The meadowlarks came back and sat on the fence posts and poured out that long liquid song they have, the most hopeful sound there is, and the pasture between my place and the tanner's, that had been a frozen killing sea in December, turned to mud and then to grass, and the cattle spread out over it fat and content, and the whole terrible night started to feel like something I dreamed. But it hadn't been a dream, and the thing it had been about, the thing the silo had really been built for, that came on through the spring and into the summer, slow and certain as the seasons. Janelle got weaker, not all at once. The way water goes out of a slough in a dry year, an inch and then an inch, so slow you can stand at the edge and not see it move but come back in a month and find the shore pulled way back from where it was. She stopped coming out to the porch. Then she stopped getting up most days. Then there came a day in August when Holly's called me, and I knew, before he said a word, from the particular quiet on the line, and asked if I'd come help him move some things out to the silo. I went, of course I went. And we made it ready, the two of us, the way you make a room ready, except we didn't say what we were making it ready for because by then we didn't have to. We brought out a real bed. We brought out her favorite chair, set by the little window Holly's had cut into the steel so she could see the prairie. We brought out photographs, the kids' drawings, the quilt her own mother had made her. We turned the warm, round room that had saved them all from the storm back into what it had always secretly been. The place where Janelle Tanner had asked, without ever quite asking, to come home to die. And here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I haven't been able to set down right until now. It wasn't sad. Or it was sad, it was the saddest thing I've ever been part of, but it wasn't only sad, and I didn't expect that. I thought helping a man prepare his wife's deathbed would be the heaviest work of my life. And it was heavy. But there was something else in it too, something I didn't have a word for until much later, and the word, I think, is grace. There is a grace in doing a hard thing well, for love, with your hands. Hollis Tanner had spent 2 years and every dime he had, and the whole weight of the county's mockery building his wife a good place to die. And now it was time, and the place was ready, and it was warm, and it was beautiful, and it was full of her whole life, and there is a grace in that I will not pretend to fully understand. She lived in the silo for 19 days. I know because I went over every one of them. Janelle, near the end, decided she didn't mind me knowing the secret after all. I think she'd known for a long time what the silo really was, the way she knew everything, and had simply let Hollis keep his secret because she understood he needed to keep it more than she needed to be told. But near the end she let it go. She talked to me about it plain, in that thin, clear voice, sitting up in the bed by the little window with the August prairie golden outside and the meadowlarks going. "He thinks he hid it from me," she said one afternoon, and there was a smile in it. "All those years, he thinks I didn't know what he was really building out here." She looked around the round, warm room at the jars, at the bed, at the window. "I've known since the first winter. I watched him insulate every inch of it by hand in the cold after working all day when he was so tired he could barely stand. A man doesn't do that for a root cellar, Walt." Her hand found mine. "He did it so I wouldn't be afraid, so that whatever happened, whenever it came, I'd be warm and I'd be home and I'd have my bobbies close and I wouldn't have to be afraid of the cold." Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Do you know what a gift that is? To love somebody so much you spend 2 years building them a place to not be afraid in." I said I thought I did. "You lost one, didn't you?" she said, then quiet. "You and Ruth, you never say, but I can tell. You get a certain look when joy climbs in your lap." She wasn't asking. "I'm sorry, Walt. I'm sorry the world took yours too soon, and I'm sorry it's taking me. But I'll tell you what I've decided, lying out here in my husband's tin can with all my summers on the shelves around me." She squeezed my hand with what strength she had. "I've decided we don't get to choose how long. Nobody gets to choose how long. We only get to choose what we do with the time we're given and who we spend it loving, and whether we let the people we love know it before it's too late to tell them." She closed her eyes. "Hollis told me every single day by building this, make sure you tell yours, Walt, however you can, while there's time." She died on a morning in early September, with the sun just up and the prairie full of that gold late summer light, in the warm round room her husband built, surrounded by every jar of every summer she'd ever put up, with Hollis holding one of her hands and Mara holding the other and Eli asleep against her side and little Joy, 4 years old, not understanding, but knowing enough to be still, curled at the foot of the bed. I wasn't in the room. I was outside, leaning on the curved steel wall in the morning sun, because some moments belong to a family alone and a neighbor knows when to step out. So I can't tell you what her last words were, or whether there were any. I can only tell you that I stood out there in the warm September morning with my hand flat against the steel of the silo. The same steel I'd hammered on that frozen morning 9 months before, begging to know if any of them were alive, and that this time I already knew the answer, and the answer was that she was going, and that the going was as gentle and warm and unafraid as one man's love had been able to make it. When Hollis came out, a long while later, he didn't say anything. He just stood beside me in the sun. And after a while a meadowlark started up on a fence post not 30 feet away, that long liquid pouring song, and we both listened to it, and Hollis Tanner, who had built his wife a fortress against the cold, who had crossed 60 yards of killing storm with his baby against his heart, who had kept the hardest secret I ever knew a man to keep, put his face in his hands and wept like a child, and I held him up, the way he'd held the roof up all that long winter night. And that was the least and the most I could do. I should end it there, probably. But there's a little more, and I think you've earned it, and I think Janelle would want me to tell it. The county talks about the silo differently now. Nobody calls it the Cranks Tin Can Fort anymore. After that winter, after 3 people died in their own warm houses in a single night, and Holly's Tanner's whole family came through without a scratch in a thing everybody told him to tear down, the talk changed. And after Janelle, after word got around quite the way it does about how she'd spent her last days out there, warm and home and unafraid, the talk changed again, into something almost like reverence. 2 fellows from the south end of the county came and asked Holly's how he'd done it, the insulation, the off-grid stove, all of it. They want to fix up their own old silos. There's talk of more of them going up. The thing the whole county laughed at is becoming, slow, the thing the whole county wants. Holly's is still on the place. The kids are still with him, of course. Eli's 11 now and shot up like a weed and still never stops moving. Joy's 6 and started school and doesn't really remember the storm, though she remembers her mother, in the way the very young remember, in flashes, in a smell, in the particular gold of a certain kind of light. And Mara is 16 now, and serious as ever, and she's told her father she wants to be a doctor. The kind that helps people at the end, she says. The kind that helps people not be afraid. I think about that a lot. I think about a 14-year-old girl dragging her dying mother through a storm, and then sitting up half the night keeping a fire with her back turned so she wouldn't have to watch. And I think about that same girl, 2 years on, deciding she's going to spend her life learning how to help people through exactly the thing she was made to face too young. The storm took something from that family in the end. It always was going to. But it gave them something too, or maybe it just showed them what they already had, which is the same thing the silo showed all of us. That love isn't a feeling you have. It's a thing you build with your hands over years, against a cold you know is coming, for people you know you can't keep forever. I keep that spiral notebook still. The page is still in there, water-warped, where I wrote the 4 words that frozen morning the silo held. They lived. I've never crossed them out, even though one of them didn't in the end, not for long, because it's still true. The silo held. And for 1 stolen winter day, and for 19 warm September days, and for a whole life of summers put up in glass on its curving shelves, every one of them lived. Right to the end. Warm and home and unafraid. Janelle told me to make sure I told mine, while there was time. Ruth's been gone 8 years, and I never did get to tell her the things I should have, and that's a cold I'll carry to my own end. But I drove into town last week and I bought a little second-hand sled, the $10 plastic kind, and I left it leaning by the tanner's door without a note, because Holly's would know, and because some things you say best without saying them at all. There's a hard winter coming. You can feel it in the high, thin clouds already, and the cattle are restless along the fence. But the silo's stocked, and the wood split and stacked, and the stove draws clean.